Greetings, everyone joining us for this year's Gallup Cookpad webinar. I'm Mohamed Younis, Gallup's editor-in-chief and your host for today's discussion. The Gallup Cookpad Home Cooking Survey has returned for its fifth year. Since 2018, our survey has tracked how often people around the world prepare and eat home-cooked meals. The latest edition explores emerging themes, including the widening of the cooking gender gap in our 2022 data and how various factors, including gender, age, household size, and others influence cooking habits and enjoyment across the globe. The report also unravels the world's typical cooking profiles, defining 5 distinct categories of home cooks, such as joyful chefs who relish any opportunity to cook a meal at home, or reluctant cooks who cook the least. Before I introduce our great speakers today, here's a run of show for how we're going to spend this hour together. After my introductions, we'll see a data presentation of the most important findings from the report, followed by a panel discussion with our experts. We'll then shift to hearing from you in our Q&A session to be thinking and encouraging you to be thinking about what you want to ask this amazing lineup of experts on the topic and the data in particular. Finally, we'll hear closing remarks from Cookpad and then adjourn. On your screen, you'll see a Q&A box where you can type in your queries at any point in the program. You'll also see a resource box where you can download the report and get more detailed information about Gallup's partnership with Cookpad and why we do this work. Finally, a recording of this event in its entirety, including the slides, will be available for download moments after we conclude. So who will we be hearing from today? Julia Wolfson is Associate Professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Nigel Scott is director of Gamos, a founding collaborator with Loughborough University on the Modern Energy Cooking Services program. Andrew Dugan is a research director at Gallup, who will be presenting the findings of the report and joining our discussion. And Hiromi Nose is the co-director of the World Cooking Index program at Cookpad and has been heavily involved in this analysis, and we'll be hearing closing remarks from her. With that, Andrew, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Mohamed, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm here to provide an update of the Global Analysis of Cooking Around the World study, or the World Cooking Index study between Gallup and Cookpad. This marks our 5th year of data collection. This effort began in 2018 with the goal of monitoring, tracking people's individuals' cooking behaviors, as well as eating home-cooked meals. And it's been, of course, a very eventful 5 years. Through this, we have also released these Global Analysis of Cooking Around the World analytical reports, which really focus on trying to understand the role of cooking in people's lives and how that has shifted over these 5 years. And you can actually find the latest report, hot off the presses, on the worldcookingindex.com website. You can see it here. And all of the results we'll be looking at, you can also find in that report with much greater detail. So I encourage you to go check out that resource. This has been an unprecedented effort, this study. We've interviewed nearly 700,000 people around the world in 150 different countries. And in a given year, 99% of the world's 15-plus population is represented by the interviews conducted as part of the World Cooking Index. So with that, let's get into the latest results. Just as a very quick background, the 2 key metrics we're going to keep our eye on are the total number of meals an individual has cooked in the past week. So that includes lunches and dinners. So for any individual, that's theoretically between 0 to 14. And the total number of home-cooked meals a person has eaten at home, regardless if they cooked it or someone else in their household cooked it. And so here's the update of those 2 key metrics. The solid orange line is our total meals cooked by individuals themselves. And we see that worldwide, people cooked an average of 6.4 meals per week, which is down from 6.7 in 2021, and notably on par with 2018, which is the pre-pandemic era. And that's really a major theme of the larger report, which is we're seeing a return to the norm, or just really people's behaviors, like in so many other facets of life, are returning to resemble at least what they were before the pandemic. And we see that to some degree also with total cooked meals eaten at home, which moved up by 0.2 and is closer to that pre-pandemic period. And a final note here is this is a very subtle pattern, admittedly, at the global level. But if you zoom in, as we will in this presentation and in our discussions, look at other regions, countries, subgroups, etc., this pattern of cooking returning to normal is even more noticeable when you zoom in at the country, region level, etc. So let's actually look at the regions. This is comparing 2022, the most recent wave of data, to 2021, the year-over-year change, in other words. And we see that in a couple of regions, notably Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Asia, the total number of meals an individual themselves cooked declined by 0.7, which you can really think of as close to one meal on average per week. There was a decline of that magnitude in those regions. In Northern America, a notable decline as well, which of course, Northern America is just the US and Canada. And it's about a little more than half a meal. And then Latin America and Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean and Central and Western Asia, the decline is just a little under half a meal. In our other regions, change is minimal to non-existent, including in northern, southern, and Western Europe, which henceforth I'm just going to call Western Europe for the sake of brevity. And I call attention to it because Western Europe is the region where cooking was the highest of all these regions at, I believe, 7.8 meals on average per week. And that's really a notable development. Over the course of this survey, this is a region that's moved from kind of middle of the pack in terms of cooking to a leader in that sense, which is something a theme we'll come back to. Then we also have our top cooking countries, and again, looking at number of meals cooked on average per week, lunches and dinners. So we have our top 10, and then in terms of cooking the most, and then our top 10. Top 10, there is clearly a statistical tie going on here, which is why you see more than 10 countries, but our top 10 in terms of cooking the least. And let's focus on the countries that cook the most. El Salvador is nominally at the top, but like a clearer takeaway from these 10 countries is that more than half of them, France, Ireland, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Italy, are all in Western Europe, which again reaffirms that pattern I mentioned a second ago. And it's worth mentioning, when this study started in 2018, most of these countries were indeed cooking more than your typical country, but they were not this high in the rankings, at least most of them. So this is a development for them that we've seen basically in 2020 and then 2021 and into this most recent year. On the other side of the equation, in terms of cooking the least, again, these are countries that have generally been in this spot. Jordan, for instance, when the study first began in 2018, was the country that cooked the least, and it essentially retains that spot in this most current wave. So we also wanted to summarize 5 themes and shifts that we've seen in cooking over the past 5 years of this study. And I should say this is far from exhaustive. Of course, there's so many other things we could pick out, but just 5 conclusions or things that we have noticed that we want to share with you. And the first one is kind of the unavoidable one, the conclusion that just kind of hits us on the head each year, and it's just so important to talk about and document, which is that gender is the single most impactful predictor of home cooking, which is kind of a fancier way of just saying that gender is super relevant. It is basically the characteristic in kind of determining or in shaping how much an individual cooks. Women cook quite a bit more than men, as we'll see when we look at the gender gap here in the next section. And this has just been kind of a constant reality throughout the study. Northern, Southern, and Western Europe, and in our second finding, Northern, Southern, and Western Europe, or Western Europe, is the region, as I mentioned, that now leads all other regions in terms of cooking, and that's something that is really quite a development in comparison to the first 2 years of our study, powered by substantial growth by, say, the United Kingdom, Ireland, France, Germany, and Belgium. The other three are more of demographic and regional focus, but very briefly, for our youngest age cohort, people aged 15 to 24, and especially a subgroup therein, the 18 to 24-year-olds. This is a group, of course, that does not cook as much as their older counterparts. But one thing that we had been noticing, and last year's report really discusses at length, is that cooking has been rising very steadily for this group. That that did not happen this year. They fell back slightly this year. So it'll be interesting to see if they can regain that momentum in future years. And then moving over to Latin America and the Caribbean. So another finding that we have found, another finding of the reports has been that education is negatively correlated with cooking. Generally speaking, there are exceptions, and indeed Latin America and the Caribbean is one of those exceptions. And when I say negatively correlated, I mean people with a higher level of education, particularly those with a college degree or university level education or more, are cook less than people with lower levels of education. In Latin America, that has not been the case. We've actually seen a great deal of growth in cooking among university graduates, and indeed they now cook more than other educational attainment levels. And then finally, in Southeastern Asia and the Pacific, perceptions of income or perceptions of household income are playing a more salient role in terms of shaping cooking behaviors and actions. Okay, so we're going to march right forward into revisiting the gender gap, which is, as Mohamed already alluded to, a big finding of this report. So for the first time in the 5 years of the study, the gender gap between men and women, which has always been notable and substantial, with women cooking more than men, widened rather than narrowed. So as you can see in the graph, these are the global trends for how many meals an individual cooked, lunch and dinner, per week. You can see obviously men are quite a bit below where women stand, but since 2019, there's been a notable uptick. They've started at 3.9 in 2018 and went up as high as 4.7 in 2021, which narrowed the gender gap to 4 meals on average that women are cooking more than men. But in this most recent year, basically all of that progress appears to have been erased, and their average, that is men's, is down to 4.0, which leaves us with a gender gap of 4.7. So women are cooking more than twice as often as men did in 2022, and we're seeing a widening, not shrinking, gender gap. Now we're looking again at our top 10 countries where the gender gap is the largest, and then the top 10 where the gender gap is the smallest. In terms of where it is the largest, including in countries such as Ethiopia, Tajikistan, Egypt, Nepal, Yemen, and Algeria, the gender gap is 8 meals. So that means women are cooking 8 meals more on average than men. That's essentially twice the global rate. But these are countries where this is nothing new. If anyone looks at the reports over the year or the data over the years, this is somewhat par for the course. But it's also just shows kind of the variation in terms of the gender gap. Even though most countries, or virtually all countries except for Italy this year, have a gender gap with women cooking more than men, the differences are quite substantial, as high as 8.6, or moving over here can get as narrow as 0.3. So moving to the top 10 countries with the smallest gender gap, obviously the first country to look at is Italy, where actually the gender gap is it has flipped, with men cooking just marginally more than women, 0.4 meals. This is notable. On one level, for one thing, Italy had a pretty formidable gender gap just a few years ago, but at the same time, Italy is representative of kind of the larger trend in Western Europe, which is that we saw men cooking more really during, it started to grow, but it really accelerated during the pandemic years. Indeed, that's one reason why Europe is cooking more as a region. And as men were cooking more, that gender gap in a lot of these countries, Spain, United Kingdom, Switzerland, France, etc., was narrowing. And for Italy, it's just, this was even more so the case, where the gender gap actually flipped. Okay, another very interesting section we want to discuss very briefly is a collaboration that Cookpad and Ajinomoto have performed this year. And Ajinomoto is a multinational food company based out of Japan. They also had a module on the 2022 Gallup World Poll, which is the poll that collects the data for the Cookpad module or the World Cooking Index. And one of the questions on the Ajinomoto module was whether an individual had occasion to experience enjoyment from cooking in the past week. So very simply, regardless of how many meals an individual cooked, as long as they did cook something, did they enjoy it? Did they enjoy the experience or not? And so we find that 58%, a solid majority of people around the world, said they enjoyed cooking in the past 7 days. And it's not even the case that the rest of those individuals who do not make up that 58% did not enjoy cooking. In fact, a larger percent, 24, said that they did not cook in the past 7 days. So it's just 17% of people who said that they did not enjoy cooking. And if you kind of factor out those 24% of people who did not cook, you'd see that it's closer to 75 or even closer to 80% of people who enjoyed cooking compared to not enjoy cooking. So that's just a reminder that cooking, even though it's an activity that does often require a lot of planning, time, there are a lot of other constraints. It's among other benefits, it can bring people joy, and these data really show that. On the same token, we do see that there is, much like with the actual activity of cooking, a substantial gender gap in terms of attitudes about cooking. So we have 76% of women saying that they enjoyed cooking in the past week compared to 40% of men, which is a gap of 36 percentage points. And in terms of men and their cooking enjoyment, it's notable that another 40% of men said they did not cook at all. So that, again, speaks to one issue with men and their potential to derive enjoyment from cooking is just kind of the lack of engagement with the activity in the first place. Though I should note that slightly more men than women did say that they did not enjoy cooking if they cooked. So then what we did was take this new question about cooking enjoyment and combine it with the two key Cookpad metrics that we've reviewed here, total amount of meals cooked by an individual and total amount of home cooked meals consumed by an individual, and as well as take reference with other survey demographics to perform a cluster analysis, which is just a statistical analysis attempting to put similar respondents into different groups. So, and the goal of this analysis was to identify the 5 types of home cooks. And I really encourage you to, if you really want to dig into this material, to consult the report on the worldcookingindex.com, because this is a very interesting analysis that I'm just going to briefly touch on. But you see that the largest group of our 5 types of home cooks is the joyful chefs at 36%. And of course, the names are somewhat indicative of kind of different qualities about them. Another 21% make up our reluctant cooks. And then the groups get slightly smaller, with 18% for the home cooking professionals and seasoned culinarians. And then finally, the smallest of all is the 7% who make up the crowded kitchen cooks. I'm not going to review the kind of defining traits of all 5 of them. We'll focus on the 2 largest, but again, a lot more information in the report if you're curious to learn about these. So let's just focus in on the joyful chefs, our largest group first. What we see is they cook on average 9.1 lunches or dinners per week, which just as a reminder, the global average was 6.4, so we can see that they cook quite a bit more than your typical person. And they also eat more home-cooked meals, just slightly more than the global average. But another notable trait about them is they universally enjoy cooking. So hence the joyful chefs. They cook quite a bit and just unanimously enjoy cooking. And as you might suspect, they are disproportionately consist of more women than men. at 75 to 25% respectively. So those are some of the key traits of the joyful chefs. Then we move to the reluctant cooks, who cook far less than any of the other groups here, with 5 meals per week. That's also quite a bit below the global average. And one thing that is their clearly defining trait is that all of them do not enjoy cooking. And I should note for this analysis, we did set aside the people who did not cook in the past 7 days. So this group does cook, not as much as most people, but they don't enjoy it, generally speaking. And thus they make up our reluctant cooks. And as you might guess, given those two traits, low cooking, lack of enjoyment, they consist of more men than women, 59 to 41% respectively. And then again, the traits of the other groups are very interesting. I encourage you to look at the report. For instance, our seasoned culinarians who cook quite a bit at 9.6 meals. One thing about them is that 42% of them fall in the 65 plus bracket, making them kind of our more experienced chefs, as just an example. Okay, so we encourage you to get cooking, but what does that mean? We'd like you, for those who are interested, we encourage you to access the World Cooking Index data. This latest data, as well as the trends, can be available to you if you visit the World Cooking Index website. You just need to submit submit the contact form with your information, and Cookpad will, in no time at all, I'm sure, have you linked up with the data, and you'll be able to access these country and regional trends. Because even if cooking is not your primary research interest, we do think this data just has the ability to speak on a lot of topics related to social science and human behavior and how things changed during the pandemic, just to name a few possibilities. So this is just a wealth of material, and we encourage you to engage with it. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mohamed.
Thanks, Andrew. Julia, I'm going to come to you first. We all kind of wear different hats here on the topic of cooking and how it impacts human behavior, as Andrew just laid out. I want to ask you, Julia, what were some of the facts or data points that really struck you or that stuck with you after you read through the report from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Mohamed, and thanks for that great presentation, Andrew. You know, I think one thing that really jumped out at me looking at the 2022 report and the other years of data is just the consistency of cooking frequency over time, even with COVID and the pandemic over the last few years. The magnitude of the differences through 2018 through 2022 are relatively small at a global level, although masking some pretty interesting regional and country level trends. So I think that's notable. And I think, you know, the thing that jumps out to me other than that is like the persistence of the gender disparities in terms of who's responsible for cooking responsibilities in the home. You know, the country level differences and the regional differences in terms of gender frequency of cooking by gender really reflect different social and cultural norms around gender roles and who's responsible for cooking, and raises a question of if we will continue to see some of these additional shifts moving forward, and especially as economies develop and gender roles shift over time. You know, it makes it really critical to have this kind of data to monitor. It's really emblematic of, you know, who is responsible for certain household chores. And so I think like that the persistence of this gender disparity is really, I think, resonates a lot. And we've done some work in our team around those disparities over time also. The last thing I'd add is just, you know, I think it's interesting when you look globally and regionally at the difference between cooking frequency and eating frequency of meals at home. And I think that's a really important distinction because you do see different trends. You know, we see that cooking frequency in 2022 compared to 21 stayed either pretty constant or decreased, but the frequency of eating home-cooked meals in many places actually increased. And I'm curious, you know, what could be driving that? We all learned somewhat different cooking patterns during COVID, you know, utilizing batch cooking, cooking more leftovers, and it really emphasizes the way that the question is framed in the report in terms of what counts as cooking or what people were prompted to include in their definition of cooking does not capture all things that are prepared at home, right? And so it does look like there are some interesting trends when you compare both the cooking frequency and then the eating frequency, which I think are pretty fascinating and ripe for more in-depth analyses.
Thank you, Julia. And before I come to Nigel, I just wanted to also reiterate, we mentioned this at the beginning, but we got a question about what do we mean by cooking at home? Here's the actual question wording that was fielded across 150 countries. By cooking at home, we mean a meal prepared at home from ingredients such as vegetables, meats, grains, or other ingredients. Please do not think about pre-made foods or leftovers that you reheat. So we were really granular with how we defined cooking at home before we began asking respondents these questions. Nigel, I want to give you a chance to reflect on the data. What really struck you? What stood out in your view?
Yeah, thanks, Mohamed. I kind of picked up on what Andrew is talking about, this extra set of questions around enjoyment. He said that it's really interesting, and that's where I've really focused. I think it's just fascinating that these kind of questions are really trying to unpack some of the cook's experience, the household experience of cooking. Maybe I can just take a step back, Mohamed. You introduced me as working for the Modern Energy Cooking Services Program. So just to sort of explain where I'm coming from, that program is generating research to try and inform transitions from cooking with biomass fuels to modern fuels. So that's mostly in low middle income countries. So I'm coming from a sort of fuels point of view and a fuels transition. And this understanding how cooks really experience cooking is critical to understanding how you can get people to transition. So the enjoyment question is such an interesting one because it's a subjective assessment of cooking, and I think Andrew said it covers a whole load of things. So cooking involves time. We've talked to a number of cooks across the world, and we find a number of issues that keep coming up is like time savings, as Andrew mentioned. So cooking on the stove, but also preparing fuels, collecting fuels, getting a stove to light, come to temperature. The idea of multitasking. So if you've got an automated control, you can go away and do something else, look after the children whilst the meal is cooking. Cleanliness is a huge issue that comes up. Cleaning pots, but also just handling soot, getting soot on your clothes, all that kind of stuff. And then the kitchen environment, full of smoke, hot and sweaty if you're cooking over a wood fire. All of these things, which we would sort of sum up as convenience, but they're part of this enjoyment. And I think it's really, really fascinating there's a lot that can be unpacked, and there are lots of aspects towards what contributes to enjoying cooking. Now, having said that, and also said he directed us to the report, and there's a really interesting chart. Well, I think it's really interesting, which you plot for each of those groups that you'd identified. There is a measure of what proportion of the group regards themselves as financially thriving. And the really interesting thing to me is that the two groups that are least likely to be thriving are the reluctant cooks and the crowded kitchen cooks. And both of those are kind of low economic status groups, and they tend not to enjoy cooking. So you're seeing this link between sort of poverty indicators, if you like, and enjoyment or the experience of cooking. And I think there's some really interesting stuff to be unpacked there.
Julia and Andrew, I want to give you both a chance to react to these groupings, the factor analysis that resulted in these groupings that Andrew laid out in the report. Let me come to you first, Julia. What was your reaction when you saw these groupings, and which of them really caught your eye as sort of insightful or interesting, something you hadn't assumed before you saw them?
Yeah, thanks. I thought that was pretty fascinating. I think the question of enjoyment of cooking is really critical for the reasons that Nigel was just articulating. And in higher income contexts, the issue of time and juggling all kinds of responsibilities, even with more modern cooking equipment, is also really critical. I was struck by just how many people enjoyed cooking, honestly. I think in our research, we've seen that actually much lower levels of enjoyment. So I thought that it was notable that 4 of the 5 groups had 100% or nearly 100% of the people in that group enjoying cooking, and it seemed like there were sort of other factors that were other sort of socio-demographic factors that were sort of driving some of those groupings. Which I think is really important and critical and speaks to all the sort of multifactorial, factors and things that contribute to the way in which people cook and their enjoyment of cooking. So I thought that those very frequent cooks who cook a lot, who enjoy cooking a lot, who are not working for full time, I think that might speak to some of that time and that juggling of different responsibilities. And yeah, I just thought that it was notable. I think the only group that didn't have a super high percentage of people enjoying cooking were those reluctant cooks, and the other 4 groups really had some interesting nuances in terms of their sociodemographic characteristics shaping those groupings.
Andrew, I'm going to come to you next on your reflection on the groupings. But before that, I want to encourage and remind you all to type your questions into the Q&A chat. Some of you already have. You may get a response typed back. We may field your response here in the discussion, but feel free to do so. We're eager to hear from you all. Andrew, you've used this kind of analysis before and a lot of other research you've done where we look at the data and really allow the data to group respondents based on their responses and their behaviors. What struck you about the groupings in this research in particular, and did anything particularly stand out to you?
Yes, thank you, Mohamed. So I agree with Julia. I think the very interesting factor that drove the analysis and ultimately the results is just how many people enjoyed cooking. It was again 58% of people, and if we're only looking at cooks, it's even more than that, as this analysis is. So that's just a great reminder that cooking can bring enjoyment to people. It's just a matter of those other constraints that Nigel was speaking about. And the reluctant cooks notwithstanding, even if we look at people who cook relatively infrequently, the rates of enjoyment at the global level and even within subgroups is fairly consistent. So it's really, if you can get someone cooking, they're very likely to enjoy it, which I know does not answer your question directly, but I just wanted to say just how powerful that measure is and how much information there is to be gleaned from it. In terms of the groups, I found them all very fascinating. The seasoned culinarians who didn't have a real opportunity to talk about are your most frequent cooks, and as I mentioned, they also are the cohort that's 65 plus. And we did not show the regional breaks, but they're concentrated largely in Europe. So these are probably, if we had the ability to kind of trend backwards, these might be the individuals who we've seen a lot of growth with over time, just by kind of what we know about people in Western Europe and that age cohort. But in general, I found it all a very useful exercise to just kind of think about cooking frequency and elements of people's background, and ultimately how many meals they can make and whether or not they enjoy the process.
You already shared some great insights on how those groupings really tie into other critical pieces to this in the real world, poverty and income. What were your other insights on the groupings in particular? What struck you? And do you find this kind of approach interesting in trying to understand how respondents are really behaving through the data versus simply just asking them, what group do you think you fall in?
Yeah, absolutely. Letting the data kind of drive these groups it can be a great opportunity to learn a lot. I think in this instance, this is a proof of that. Other than the polarization of cooking enjoyment, either for the most part, these groups either enjoyed it or did not. The other factors, the role of employment, for instance, is clearly very important, which again gets to those kind of time constraints that people might have, as well as household size, which really is an important factor in trying to understand these cooking trends. With the crowded kitchen cooks, these are individuals who also tend to live in, crowded households, and that's reflected in their name. And also, that's another factor to consider in the kind of differentiation of the two indicators that Julia was mentioning, the total meals cooked and the total meals consumed at home. Is just how many other people are in there, and whether or not, what is the distribution of kind of responsibility in terms of household chores. So those are a few insights I think that come out of there.
Julia, I wanted to dig in deeper with you on demographic differences. Andrew mentioned gender gaps in cooking. What were the demographic shifts or differences, gaps that really struck you as you looked through these data?
Yeah, thanks. I'm struck by, when you look at sort of the individual breakdowns in terms of cooking and eating frequency by different demographic differences and socioeconomic differences, that there seems to be a real sort of like life course narrative around cooking frequency, looking at differences by age, by marital status, by household size, are really pretty fascinating, digging in globally and at the regional level. Cooking behavior shifts across the life course, with people as they start to live independently, get married, have children, are raising families, and then in older age are, not having to cook for as many large households, or perhaps are cooking for multi-generational households. It's really, those are really fascinating sets of results that I think we didn't have time to dig into in this presentation, but are there in the report. And then, aside from that kind of life course perspective, I think there's a real story that's fascinating around urbanicity, income, and education. There are some pretty clear differences with people living in urban locations and people with greater household wealth and education, cooking and eating less home cooked meals than their counterparts in more rural settings or with lower household incomes, which, depending on your context, could speak to, what are your alternatives to eating home cooked meals? How many alternatives exist in your immediate food environment? And when you have more options to not be cooking at home and still eating good meals or feeding your family, how often you are able to take advantage of that. So I think there's this sort of socioeconomic rural-urban dichotomy, and also this kind of life course story that's really fascinating to be able to dig into at this global level, which is just so unique for this data.
Nigel, I'm going to come to you in a second, but I've got to share a question in our Q&A that we got here, which made me smile, which is, does making a sandwich count as cooking? And technically, per the survey, it actually does, as long as you made the sandwich yourself. And that's an important, although a little bit humorous, but an important point to make, that we think of cooking oftentimes based on the context of the societies we live in. Maybe that happens over a stove, tends to involve an oven, etc. But what we really try to do with this study is to cast a broad enough net to capture all different walks of life, all different income groups and economic situations where people don't have access, for example, to a hot fire stove, or are cooking in a communal setting between multiple households. As we know, in the global South is a reality for a lot of people. Nigel, these data are fascinating and they're interesting for those of us who are obsessed with cooking. But of course, there are so many more applicability dimensions to what we're learning here. What are some of the ways that you feel like these data could be helpful in informing other research around topics that you focus on in your work?
Thanks, Mohamed. Well, I think just picking up on what Julia was talking about, alternatives, what alternatives are people seeking? I think we found that it's a fascinating part of the work that we are doing is the advent of the kind of eating out industry. I was looking at some figures recently, and there's huge differences in estimations, but there seems to be universal agreement that the eating out industry is a real growth industry. I mean, I've seen figures of between 10% to 50% annual growth rates being predicted for the next few years. And interestingly, about half of that growth is forecast to be taking place in Asia. So it's all driven by technology. So, in the countries where I am, we've got Uber and these companies that are doing deliveries. So there's technology and there's the fast foods bringing down the costs. So it's becoming very low cost. So the alternatives that people have are becoming much wider and more plentiful and much more cheap and available in many African countries. Now you have burgeoning industries around the fast foods and fast food delivery. So the patterns of people's eating behaviors is going to change, and I think that has a lot of implications. Eating out is not necessarily a good thing. We need to keep an eye on that, and policymakers need to be aware of the changes that are happening. And I think that's sort of one area where this kind of information can be really helpful. I wanted to mention as well what I haven't described the work that we've done with the Gallup data, but it was relating it to policy on energy transitions. And one of the aspects of energy transitions is carbon and carbon finance, because cooking with biomass fuels is estimated to contribute to about 2% of global carbon emissions equivalent. So it's not that's sort of equivalent to the global airline industry. This is a serious business, and more importantly, there's serious money, carbon finance that could be attracted into to help finance clean cooking transitions. This is cooking fuels, and it crosses our mind that one of the problems that we have in the carbon finance sector is validating the amount of fuel that is displaced by modern fuels. Well, the sort of data that you've got here tells us how many meals people are eating. With Internet of Things and mobile phone connected devices like electric or LPG cooking stoves can tell us how many meals people are cooking with their stoves. Well, you can combine that data to give you another estimate of the number of meals where modern fuels are displacing biomass fuels. And that's the kind of metric that could be used to help validate this sort of carbon financing mechanisms. So there's some really interesting areas and potentially really valuable. And we in our work, we just married the Gallup World Index information with a third-party database on energy fuel choices. And I think there must be all sorts of sectors that could benefit from that, because it's this quality of subjective user information that we find is really valuable, and we think it's particularly relevant to the kind of work that we're all doing. So I think we find it really helpful. Thank you.
Julia, I want to come back to you. And before I do that, I want to encourage our audience to type in whatever questions you have. The ones that have come in have been phenomenal. Julia, a lot of your focus beyond this work, obviously, is related to the sort of connection between diet-related choices and diet-related disease risk. I know you study a lot of other topics in that space, but what were your reflections from that point of view on some of these data? In other words, can we say that people who are frequent cooks or cookers are less likely to experience diet-related disease risks, or is that beyond what kind of the data have shown us in these industries?
That's a great and complicated question. So, I think that is a super important question that these data can be helpful for answering. I don't think we can necessarily say that yet, and I don't think we can necessarily say that universally here. There's opportunity that should be taken and is being taken to pair these data with other data sources that can help start to address that exact question. Because really the question is, what are people eating when they're cooking, and what are they eating when they're not cooking, right? And so pairing this kind of cooking frequency and frequency of eating meals at home data with dietary intake data, with other data sources for rates of diet-related diseases, can really be helpful to start to dig in to answer those questions. At a country level, we have country level data sets that can answer these questions pretty well in certain contexts, but sometimes they lack the specificity in terms of the cooking measures. Actually, we have good dietary data in some places and not great cooking data. And so finding opportunities to start to dig in on the relationship between cooking frequency, dietary intake, and diet-related health outcomes is super important. I think the other parts of health are also really important, thinking about not just dietary intake and rates of diet-related diseases, but food insecurity, stress, mental health. These are all, sort of the complex picture of what shapes health, and being able to look at the role of cooking as part of other household and life responsibilities, and how potentially, enjoyment of cooking might reduce stress, which might be good for mental health. Or, on the flip side, having to be the one doing all the cooking in your household, if you don't enjoy it, might increase stress and might be a source of, poor mental health and disparities. And, of course, food insecurity and resources for the full mix of the full picture of what people are eating, how that relates to health, and how cooking fits into that, I think is really complicated, because as we've shown in our research, not all cooking is healthy cooking. I think that kind of is obvious, but it is worth stating. It's not the act of cooking that makes something healthy. It's what you're cooking and how.
And perhaps a perfect segue to, why you're cooking. It also is so nuanced and complicated. As you mentioned, Julia, some folks you can imagine are, just love it as an activity. They find, enjoyment in it. In other situations, it's really a necessity. It's maybe not something somebody wants to do, but feels the need that they have to do based on the responsibilities and their options where they live. We have a great question on this point, and I want to direct it to Andrew from our audience. And here it is. I'd love to know if more frequent cooking with enjoyment also leads to greater enjoyment of life in general. Now, Andrew, I know we don't ask about enjoyment, but we do ask about life evaluation measures. Did you see anything to allude to that in the work that you did for this report?
Yes, great. That's a great question. So we actually have a forthcoming in-depth analysis of this for Mohamed, who was the partner of Cookpad, to have both this cluster analysis that we reviewed, and they have a report that's going to really dive into this enjoyment question. But I think I can just give a peek of the results, which is to say we did find a relationship, and that was one that in terms of people who are considered thriving on the Gallup World Poll, and that means that they rate their current lives highly, and they rate their lives in 5 years highly as well. We call this people thriving. So people who enjoy cooking are statistically more likely to be thriving than people who do not enjoy cooking. And that's true after controlling for a range of different factors, including demographics, region, country income, etc. But it's also true, interestingly, if one includes the people who do not cook, so kind of people who enjoyed cooking versus those who did not and did not cook, or if we just isolate the group to people who did cook and divide it between those who did not enjoy and those who did enjoy. Either way, we do see a statistically significant effect. And like I said, there will be more information about that coming out here shortly.
We also have another great question from our audience, and I'll open up to whoever wants to tackle this one. The question is, you've done some analysis on age differences, but is there further thought on patterns of cooking in different age groups? I am particularly interested in older adults. Andrew, maybe you're a good person to start with. What did we learn about older adults and cooking habits?
Sure. So for our report, just to be clear, we our oldest age category was 65 plus. And obviously, I guess the caveat I'll start off with is there are regional variations. There are exceptions to the trends I'll mention, but really it actually has been a very interesting age cohort to monitor over the past 5 years, and that's been especially true of the pandemic. They actually drove, or at least were one of the groups that were driving a lot of the changes that we saw in some regions in some countries, including in Western Europe, including here in the United States. They tended to, all right, let's start with the baseline. They tend to be the group that cooks more than most other age cohorts. That's not true everywhere, and it's not like hands down kind of a lead, but they also showed the greatest growth over that time period, especially in 2020 and 2021. And you have to think that this is a group that during the pandemic would have been kind of technically part of the vulnerable populations who might have been staying home, even if there wasn't a legal any legal restrictions in terms of your movement. But it may be that a lot of them kind of got reacquainted with cooking during this time period. Can't be clear on that, but whatever the case is, it appears that they have one of the more long-lasting shifts. At least if this most recent survey is it tells us anything, it's that they continue to cook at elevated rates through the pandemic.
Julia and Nigel, this will be my final question to you all, and then we're going to hear from Hiromi for some closing remarks. Are there any other ways cooking can become more equitable in households around the world? Julia, I alluded to this in our exchange earlier. What are some of the ways that you see a more equitable distribution in households taking place? Or is that really something we should be striving for based on what you've seen here through these data?
Yeah, I think that's another kind of interesting and difficult question. I think one thing that is not necessarily just explored in this report, but we've explored in our research is, one thing that drives enjoyment is having confidence and high cooking skills, right? And being confident that you can cook, knowing how to cook, and having not having time being such a barrier around cooking. So investing in programs and policies that build cooking skills among all people, both men and women, in multiple contexts, is through schools or through other programs, is one, I think, kind of long-term strategy that might improve cooking enjoyment and therefore also kind of shift those skills that are required that might have some shifts in terms of the gender balance and equity of who's cooking. But the other thing I think about this question sometimes is, is more balance, or is, does everybody need to cook? Does everybody need to be able to enjoy cooking? What is the right way to think about this kind of household chore where, not everybody does need to be able to do it. If one person is highly skilled or really enjoys it, and that's the thing they really like to do, the other people don't necessarily need to be the ones to also share that responsibility. I think the question is, what else are those people doing? What is the balance of the sort of overall picture of household tasks, and is there equity there? So I think that's where, other questions in the Gallup poll, other time use data can be useful to paint a full picture of how cooking fits in, and paint a fuller picture of where there is equity in terms of household chores. I think it's a problem then if other tasks are also disproportionately falling to women, and how that then continues to evolve in different social contexts, economic contexts. But cooking is one part of a fuller picture of household and life responsibilities, and making sure that we have a full picture of that equitable balance and work towards that, I think is critical.
Nigel, you'll probably tackle the question from a different angle, maybe more about equitability or equitable societies around cooking. But let me ask you, are there any other ways cooking can become more equitable around the world?
Yeah, again, picking up what Andrew's point, that was it's, gender was the driving factor that hit him on the head, right? So we've kind of been thinking quite a bit about that, and there's a couple of issues I could maybe point to. So Julia mentioned the idea of skills, understanding, knowing how to cook, and we find that especially young people are looking to new ways to learn those cooking skills. So traditionally, in the countries where we've been researching, traditionally people would learn those kind of skills from their mother-in-law, grandmother, or whatever. And increasingly, technology is playing a role. So people are going to the internet, they're going to YouTube, but obviously just within the young people. But of course, those are tomorrow's mothers, fathers, grandfathers, and so on. So there will be trends in how people access those skills, and bear in mind that men and women, actually probably men have a slightly higher access to those kind of information technologies than women. So we might be able to see some sort of a balancing there. The other issue we've looked at is decision making within the household. So if you look at if you ask people about who's responsible for the cooking, it's almost exclusively women. So women have decision-making powers over day-to-day decisions or relating to cooking. What to cook or how to buy the fuel or whatever. But if you ask people about household investments, so here now we're talking about the stoves that are used to make, then it tends to be it's much more higher proportion of men. So one of the effects that we haven't proven it yet, but we think is potentially interesting, is that as you get more modern technology and you have this aspiration within low-income households towards modern living and being part of a modern society, you may start to see, and cooking is part of that, then you may start to see a greater involvement of men in just engaging in the cooking decisions within the household.
Fascinating point. I'm going to conclude our panel discussion here. Next, we're going to hear closing remarks from Hiromi Nose. She is co-director for the World Cooking Index program at Cookpad. Hiromi, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Thanks, Mohamed, and thank you so much to our panelists, Julia, Nigel, Andrew, for your very thoughtful and insightful comments, and for Mohamed for leading this wonderful discussion. And I also want to thank everyone here who's been tuning in for your interest and your time today. Again, as Mohamed mentioned, I'm Hiromi Nose. I'm the co-director of the World Cooking Index project at Cookpad. And I just want to start by sharing with you a little bit about Cookpad. Cookpad is the world's largest online home cooking community. We were founded 25 years ago in Japan, and today we have roughly 100 million monthly users in more than 70 countries. I mentioned community. Cookpad is a little different from other recipe sharing sites that you may be familiar with, in the sense that our free website and app allows users not only to share their recipes and tips, cooking tips, but it also allows them to engage with other community members. So we're kind of like a social networking site for home cooking. And the reason that we've designed Cookpad to be interactive is because our mission is to make everyday cooking fun. And this sense of enjoyment is something that came up a lot in today's discussion. But our belief is that the more that people enjoy cooking, the less that they will outsource cooking to other alternatives, such as the food delivery services or ready-made meals, and continue to cook. So why do we want people to cook? We believe that when people cook, they're making a conscious choice to become creators and not just consumers. And through this process of creation, they're developing an understanding of where the ingredients come from, seasonality, how they can be combined to make a wide array of dishes, and even how they're packaged. And we believe that understanding these aspects of food and cooking will change the way that people prepare and consume food, and ultimately have an impact on people's both physical and mental health, but also the health of communities, and potentially have an impact on the world. And that's basically the core belief that is behind the reason that we continue with this research, tracking how cooking is evolving around the world every year. And, I think that today's discussion really highlighted the need to go deeper into the research to really understand who are these people who enjoy cooking, and how does home cooking correlate with other important life factors such as health, such as human relationships and consumption behaviors. And for us, and because of that, it's really important for us to connect with researchers and organizations who are interested in going deeper into this problem. And it's been such a huge honor for us to start working with these researchers and organization, two of whom, Julia and Nigel, joined us today and shared their wonderful insights with us. And we are looking to collaborate more with other researchers and organizations as well. If you feel that our raw data now, we have 5 years worth of this wonderful data that has so much potential in our hands. If you feel like your research can benefit from collaborating with us, please do reach out to us through our website, and we would love to start a discussion with you on how we could potentially collaborate. Again, it's truly been an honor having this opportunity to introduce and share our latest report with you. I hope that you found the discussion as fascinating as I found it, and that you would enjoy going through the report as well. Again, thank you, everyone, and I look forward to collaborating further with each and every one of you.
Thank you, Hiromi, and thanks to each of our great speakers for sharing your insights. I also want to thank each of you for joining us today and posing your excellent questions. As a reminder, a recording of this entire program will be available for download shortly after we conclude. Finally, I want to thank the entire Cookpad Gallup team, who are too many to name here, for their work on this important report. Thank you for joining us. We are adjourned.